second. Just playing the tune. That over. Ordered down to regulate the city. Made the rebels walk and chalk and was not held the forest of the rich and godly was the devil. Holy for the motherland, holy for the motherland, and keep you standing. Hurrah! 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 You have to get to be on the headstone show, but hey, we gave it a good
The kind of interesting story about the flag is that Ben Butler discovered that American flags were made out of English bunting. So when he found that out, he sent a representative down to Washington to put in a law that American flags had to be made out of American bunting. And then, when the law was passed, he rushed right back to Lowell and started the American Bunting Company. He didn't wait around. And that eventually morphed into the Ames textile, because all his descendants were Ameses through his daughter, Blanche Butler Ames. And Jonathan Stevens last year, or was it the year before, who's the CEO of the American Textile Museum, came and talked to us. Another nice Lowell story is that when first Ben Butler came and kind of took over Baltimore, which was in the danger of becoming rebel, and then he went to Annapolis, where they were going to bring the 6th Massachusetts and the 19th New York into Washington, because Washington was right in Confederate territory. And when they got to the train yard, they discovered the locomotive had all been taken apart by the Confederates. So they're all standing around, and some worker from Lowell came up to the general and said, "General Butler, I think we made this engine in Lowell." So they they spent all night putting the engine back together, and they rolled into Washington with the Massachusetts 6th and the 14. Did I say 19? Partly the reason we're all getting together today is that Thomas Johnson, a historian, wanted to connect with all of us and celebrate Ben Butler. And he's going to give us a talk today. He's a professor at UMass Boston and Bentley College in history, American history. And here's the title of his talk: Partners for Freedom, General Benjamin Butler, Contraband of War. Perhaps you've heard about this lately. U.S. Emancipation and Global Perspective. So without further ado, come on, Tom, tell us about it.
The first thing to do is I have a whole bunch of handouts. There are 3 different ones. I think there's about 16 to 20 copies. So take one of each and pass them on, and maybe just go this way so everybody gets some. If there's more than 20 people here, so you might have to share.
Let me say one more thing. We did, Cindy Brown and some others came here and fixed the flag. And yeah, that's right. And of course they had to have there was no 12-year-old boy to climb up the flag and put it up there.
Okay, you might all want to move in a little bit more, especially my friend Dave, who's taking pictures. And if you want to come closer too, that would be great. First of all, I want to thank the Sons of the Union veterans of the Civil War, all the descendants of the Butler, Ames, and Hildreth families, and everyone who's in attendance today for coming on a clear but brisk November day. I sometimes wish Butler was born in July. It would have been deal with this, but we couldn't ask for better November weather. And it's an honor to speak here today with all of you and in memory of General Benjamin Butler. I'll give you a brief outline of what I'll do and then get into the talk. I'm going to begin and end with a bit of a personal dimension. And the talk, I think, will last about 20 minutes. I haven't timed it, but I think that's about right. Then I'll talk about Butler at Fortress Monroe in Virginia and his interactions and his policy of treating runaway slaves as contraband of war. Then I want to talk about patterns of resistance, slave resistance and flight, not only in the United States, but also briefly in Brazil and French West Africa, because there are 3 major slave exoduses where the slaves themselves helped to end slavery that involved hundreds of thousands of people running away to freedom. And then I'll conclude this. I do want to begin with the personal family angle. I first heard about Benjamin Butler over many years because there's a lot of New Orleans Johnsons. And while they're among the more liberal ones in New Orleans and Louisiana, they regaled me with tales of Beast Butler, Spoons Butler, and the Woman Order. And if you go to New Orleans, you definitely get a negative picture of Benjamin Butler, which was what I sort of carried around with me for a number of years. But in the last couple of years, I've begun to discover that there's another side to this story, and his life and his role in the Civil War and afterwards is better understood, I think, from a more northern perspective, which all of you have brought today, I believe. So one of the main sources for this evolving new perception of Benjamin Butler is this wonderful book, and there's a couple of extra copies, by Adam Goodhart, called 1861, and it's about the earliest days of the Civil War, ends even before the Battle of First Bull Run. But there's a lengthy chapter about Butler, Fortress Monroe, and the contrabands.
Tell them about this, too.
Thank you. Oakes has asked me to point out that on a previous occasion, Michael Pearson of UMass Lowell, my UMass colleague at a different campus, gave a talk on Butler in New Orleans. And that also contributes to the revision of the interpretation of Butler's role. So my new perspective comes partly from Goodhart's book, and I'm going to read a short passage from it. I think that, love him or hate him, Butler was a larger-than-life figure. Virtually all would agree, North or South, he was someone who made things happen. He was a maker of history. And of course, in New Orleans, he wasn't very popular. So one thing they did after he issued the Woman Order, which was intended to protect the honor and the persons of the Union Army and Navy there, it was shortly after America's greatest admiral, David Farragut, had been insulted by Confederate women dumping contents of a chamber pot on him. So this order was designed to protect the honor and the persons of his men. And as it turns out, there's a museum in New Orleans that sells replicas of the chamber pot, and that's it right over there. And it's sitting on top of a copy of the Woman Order. Unfortunately, it arrived broken into 3 pieces. It actually broke perfectly because it displays better now. But it just goes to show you can't trust the neo-Confederates any better than you can trust the Confederates. Now, this was intended as an insult, but I think it should be embraced as a badge of honor. Someone so infuriating to slavers and traitors must have been doing something right. So let me turn to Butler's time at Fortress Monroe. He was what was called a political general appointed by Abraham Lincoln to solidify support for the war among key northern constituencies. In Butler's case, factory towns in Massachusetts and northern Union Democrats. And he was a Democrat, but very much a Union man. And he went overnight from being an obscure militia colonel to a major general in the Union Army, and he helped get the first troops to Washington, D.C. in April 1861 to defend the capital against the rebels across the river, across the Potomac River in Virginia. And then he was appointed to command at Fortress Monroe, the only Union military installation that's remained uncaptured in the South. And troops were pouring in there daily to protect it, and eventually it became a launching pad for General McClellan's Peninsular Campaign in 1862. But in May 1861, Butler arrived there on the very day that Virginia seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy, and that very night, and I don't think it was a coincidence, 3 men, enslaved African Americans who belonged to a Colonel Mallory of the Virginia militia, decided that they would, on the very night, as I said, that Virginia seceded, they decided themselves to secede from the Confederacy and to liberate themselves. Self-liberation. They didn't need the help of abolitionists or soldiers, but they got their help later. Like other runaways, these 3 men, and I think more people here are likely to know these names than elsewhere, but I will like to mention them anyway. Frank Baker, Shepard Mallory, and James Townsend. These men were heroes. They personally started the beginning of the end of slavery in the United States. And like other runaways, they were incredibly courageous and took great risks to liberate themselves. It was no small feat to do that, although they did it under cover of darkness. Now, the Virginians were busy celebrating their secession, so their attention was distracted. This made it even better opportunity for them to escape, and they rowed a small boat across Hampton Roads from the south side of the James River to Fortress Monroe at the entrance to the James River. In taking such initiatives, the slaves themselves helped to destroy slavery. They are historical actors themselves. They exercise historical agency and made history, but they didn't make it alone. They had help, and they helped others, which is why the title of my talk is Partners for Freedom. The partners in particular are Baker, Mallory, Townsend, and Butler, but there are others too, and that's where the subtitle comes in. General Benjamin Butler, Contraband of War and U.S. Emancipation in Global Perspective. This is just one, the mass flight of several 100,000 enslaved African Americans. There's just one of 3 major slave exoduses over the next 50 years. The others being in Brazil and French West Africa. And I'll say a couple of minutes, speak for a couple of minutes about those, just to give you a sense of the broader pattern of history that Baker, Mallory, Townsend, and Butler were part of. Many of you here, I think, know more about the details of Butler's life than I do, so I'm not even going to try to match that knowledge. My goal is to give a broader perspective and put it in sort of world historical context. So, Freedom's Fort, as it was called, Fortress Monroe and the Contrabands, as I said, the only federal military institution that remained free territory in the South throughout the whole war. At the time of the census in 1860, the last one before the U.S. Civil War, there were 3,950,528 slaves listed in the 1860 census. About 40%, maybe a little bit more, of the southern population. So we can say 4 million slaves, and several 100,000, perhaps 400,000 or more, actually ran away. Many of them ended up behind Union lines in safety. But the number is imprecise because many ran away and stayed elsewhere in the South, and those weren't counted. But we can safely say that the numbers are bigger for the runaways than any official total. In fact, many of the statistics, I have a few to offer, are going to be estimates or imprecise because of poor record keeping, especially in pre-colonial and early colonial West Africa. But Baker, Mallory, and Townsend were the first 3. They were followed very shortly, almost the same day, the next day, by people who were also owned by the same master. And then more came, and more, and there were 900 people there. self-liberated people, Fortress Monroe, within the first month. Eventually, 25,000 of them spent some time at Fortress Monroe, and many of them stayed there, but others went elsewhere, joined the Union Army, worked as laborers and so forth, performing essential military-related labor. Eventually, about 180,000 African Americans served in the Union military, most in the Army, some in the Navy. Many were former slaves, probably more than half, but many were free as well. 10% of the total Union Army military during the course of the whole war were African Americans, but at the end of the war, 25% of the soldiers currently in the military then were African American, and they were the ones who were occupying the South. So the Southerners and the rebels and traitors and slaveholders saw something they had never wanted to see: armies of strong, proud black men conquering their territory. To me, that sounds like justice. Now, I'll just make a quick note on the current status of Fortress Monroe. 2/3 of it now is a national park, the northern and southern thirds of it. In the middle third of it is still private land, vulnerable to private development. I don't think they should put condos there or a golf course. But Virginians are perhaps the ones who are making it, Virginia, a purple state, not a red state anymore, need help. They need our help to keep the entire site intact. And I think that unifying all of Fortress Monroe's site into one national park would be the most fitting monument of all to the contrabands and to General Butler. And you can look up Fortress Monroe on the internet and see the organizations that are petitioning for that. You can sign petitions, send a letter to Governor Terry McAuliffe of Virginia, who is behind this. But they need your help, and this is a good way to express the union and the reunion of the United States. I think we can work with Virginians now, right? So now I'll talk about slave resistance and flight, first in the U.S. South. Who abolished slavery, not only in the U.S. and elsewhere? Well, for a long time, most of the credit would go to abolitionists, professional political activists or agitators. Some were members of Parliament in Great Britain. Britain, of course, was the first major country to abolish the slave trade and then slavery. Of course, they weren't the first state, meaning political unit, to abolish slavery. That honor goes to our northern neighbor, Vermont. In its first constitution of 1777, they abolished slavery. A courageous decision, made somewhat less courageous by the fact that virtually no black people lived in Vermont then or now, and even fewer slaves were there. So they weren't making a big sacrifice, but they didn't have to do it, and they did. But who abolished slavery? Most would say in the U.S., Abraham Lincoln and the U.S. Army. But I will quote from Frederick Douglass now: "Those who would be free must themselves strike the first blow." And the slaves did that, first non-violently by resisting slavery throughout the time of slavery, then by running away, and then by joining the Union Army and taking up arms to conclusively free themselves, their families, neighbors, and other Southerners too. And they were successful, as we know. However, as I've said, there's a long tradition of slaves resisting slavery, not necessarily through open rebellion of the that Nat Turner led in Virginia in 1831, or the Haitian Revolution of 1791. Slave rebellions, open rebellions in the United States were relatively rare. Why was that? Because it was dangerous. There was the whites outnumbered the blacks. They were well armed and organized, and in fact, the origins of modern police forces in the United States comes not from the inspiration of Robert Peel, who founded the Bobbies, the London police force in the 1820s, but in the U.S. South, comes from the slave patrols, which were organized to control and intimidate and brutalize the Southern African Americans. They were successful for doing that. So when you read about Southern policemen now shooting African Americans, They're simply performing the task that their predecessors were assigned to do 150 and more years ago. So, what's called open rebellion or running away, marronage, grand marronage, maroon societies, these are communities of escaped slaves, much more common in the Caribbean and in Brazil than they were in the southern United States. But there's also such a thing as petit marronage, small marronage, which means hidden and everyday forms of resistance. This is a key basis for mass flight in the Civil War. They were already used to supporting each other, mitigating to the extent they could, which was limited, the harsh impacts of slavery. This involves such things as refusing to work sometimes. You could actually go on strike and get away with it, at least sometimes, by withdrawing labor at key points in the annual agricultural cycle. They would slow down their work. It was often noted that slave labor was inefficient and unproductive. Well, if they don't have the positive incentives of other workers, what else would you expect? They also engage in labor bargaining, and there's quite a bit of bargaining to either limit work hours, allow slaves to grow their own crops and sell their surplus to feed themselves, to be sure they were provided with adequate tools and so on and so forth. So it's a harsh and oppressive institution, but not one where all freedom and all latitude was removed from them. And there's a constant battle, not necessarily violent, a battle of wills between slave owners and their human property. They would run away temporarily too, to woods, swamps, and mountains, and then return after negotiating a better work conditions, for instance. And they also made great use of intelligence and family, neighborhood, kin, and support networks. And they drew on all of these resources when they decided to absent themselves permanently from their masters, which happened frequently throughout the Civil War. But it first happened at Fortress Monroe in late May 1861. As it turns out, the Hampton, Virginia area, Fort Monroe is just 1 mile from Hampton, Virginia. It was one where many slaves were fairly autonomous. This wasn't the plantations of Mississippi and Louisiana growing sugar and cotton, where there's large gangs of driven labor. They tended to work more on their own, in small holdings, and be artisans, and have more freedom of movement. And therefore they knew the neighborhood, they knew the highways and byways, and could make their escape more easily. And I will read briefly from Fortress Monroe. They were interviewed by General Butler, and he determined that they had valuable military intelligence, and the situation was different now. They ran away from masters in a state that no longer was part of the United States, or so they claimed. And when the next day Major John Carey came to under flag of truce to talk to Butler about how the war would be waged in this neighborhood, among the things he asked for was the return of these slaves. Now, Carey and Butler knew each other from Democratic conventions before the Civil War, so they're acquaintances but not friends. But at this point, they're on different sides. And here's a brief excerpt. Carey said, "I am informed that 3 Negroes belonging to Colonel Mallory have escaped within your lines. I am Colonel Mallory's agent and have charge of his property. What do you mean to do with these Negroes?" "I intend to hold them," Butler said. Here Carey reminded the general about the Fugitive Slave Act. "Do you mean then to set aside your constitutional obligation to return them?" This was, of course, a question Butler had expected, and he had prepared what he thought was a fairly clever, even a rather witty answer, and I agree. "I mean to take Virginia at her word, as declared in the Ordinance of Secession passed yesterday," he said. "I am under no constitutional obligations to a foreign country, which Virginia now claims to be." And Carey says, "But you say we cannot secede, and so you cannot consistently detain the Negroes." Butler said, "But you say you have seceded, so you cannot consistently claim them. I shall hold these Negroes as contraband of war, meaning property used to prosecute the war against the Union, since they are engaged in the construction of your battery and are claimed as your property. Butler had read up on his military law and knew that under wartime conditions, federal law no longer applied in states which claimed to no longer be part of it. And he put them to work on his fortifications. In fact, once they arrived there the night before, the story spread quickly among the garrison, and those men were soon admired by the soldiers there for their boldness and their ingenuity in engineering their escape. But as I said, this is just a little trickle that began a huge flood of runaways. And as I said, probably over 400,000 ran away, provided valuable military and civilian labor, and helped win the war for the North. But as I said also, this is the first example of mass flight that helped to end slavery. It wasn't the last. And now I will turn for a couple of minutes and talk about two other parts of the world in my capacity as a world historian. First is resistance and flight in Brazil. Brazil was a former Portuguese territory, the largest slave society in the world. 40%, up to 40% of all the Africans who arrived alive in the Western Hemisphere came to Brazil. So if you wanted to imagine a typical slave, if there's such a thing, they wouldn't have been living in the United States, speaking English, attending a Protestant church, and growing cotton. They would have been living south of the equator, speaking or learning to speak Portuguese, practicing some form of Catholicism or syncretic Afro-Brazilian religion, and growing most likely sugar in the 16th through 18th centuries, and then coffee in the 19th century. In 1887, there were 723,419 slaves in Brazil, down from about 1.5 million in 1873. The peak in 1817 and 18 was nearly 2 million slaves in Brazil, one half of the entire population. Brazil became independent in 1822. It remained a monarchy. It was the only monarchy in the Western Hemisphere throughout the 19th century, with their own emperor, two emperors, Emperor Pedro I and then Pedro II. Pedro II ruled for a very long time, from 1831 to 1889. He was personally opposed to slavery, therefore could have been one of the partners for freedom with the Brazilian slaves. But he was a gradualist. He thought that slavery would be abolished gradually and almost naturally without necessarily recognizing that you have to take positive steps to end an institution and a practice like that. On the other hand, his daughter, Princess Isabel, was much more activist. She was an active abolitionist. She was the first female head of state in the Western Hemisphere who served as regent 3 times when her father traveled to Europe. And the first time in 1871, she helped encourage and signed into law the law of free womb, which said that children of slaves in Brazil would be born free from then on. So with the Atlantic slave trade over after 1850 and no one being born a slave, slavery would of course die out what the slaves did, but that would take too long. So she signed that into law, and then what happened in the last decades of slavery in Brazil was that the old slave plantation areas of northeast Brazil, the Nordeste, was no longer so profitable there. So they sold a lot of their slaves, eventually 300,000 of them, and they were transported south to the burgeoning coffee plantations of São Paulo State, Rio de Janeiro, and so forth. Brazil was the largest coffee producer in the world at that time. So this was like a second middle passage. Some of them sailed on slave ships from the Brazil's Nordeste down to the southeast Brazil. Others marched hundreds of miles overland. A terrible ordeal by land or sea. And when they arrived there, they were in new surroundings, new masters. They didn't have the old ties of loyalty that they did to older masters. And when the Brazilian abolitionist movement, which was very late and tardy, revived in the 1880s, mostly an urban movement among both black and white Brazilians. In the handouts you've got pictures of slaves in Brazil, a picture of Princess Isabel, and a picture of Senor Gomez, a black Brazilian abolitionist as well. So we have some visual materials there for you. And the Brazilian abolitionist movement was not homegrown. It was based very much on pressure from Great Britain, a longtime trading partner of Portugal, Brazil, and Portugal's protector during the Napoleonic Wars too. But slavery was in decline in Brazil. And as I said, abolitionism came late, in the last couple of years before slavery was abolished in 1888, 1886, 87, 88, tens of thousands of slaves did what Misters Baker, Mallory, and Townsend did. They liberated themselves, and this is, of course, is a great risk because you could be recaptured, punished, sold, even executed. But tens of thousands of them, we don't know the exact numbers unfortunately, fled Brazil's plantations to the cities such as Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Santos, and so forth, where they were welcomed there. And so slavery was collapsing before Brazilians' eyes, and when the law was passed, May 13th, 1888, the Lei Reale, or Golden Law, it was once again, this law was signed by Princess Isabel. Serving once again as regent, slavery was abolished altogether in Brazil. A decision made easier by ready access to alternative labor, especially from Southern Europe. So immigrants from Europe and also from Japan were coming to work on the coffee estates of southern Brazil. In fact, Brazil has more people of Japanese descent in it than any other country in the world except Japan itself. So that's where the replacement labor came from. Now I'll turn to the last episode, which came about France, as an imperial power, owned most of the territory in West Africa and in the North Africa too, except for a few British colonies there. Britain was still the major colonial power in Africa. France too was very tardy and indecisive in ending slavery. They first abolished it in 1794 in a failed effort to keep their very valuable sugar colony of Haiti. Then Napoleon restored slavery in 1802. Then in the 1848 revolutions in Europe, it was finally and conclusively abolished. And one of the leaders of that movement was Victor Schelker, whose picture you have in the handouts there. Lived a very long time, eventually lived into the 1890s, and helped to encourage the ending of slavery in France's new colonial empire in Africa. So he was still fighting for black liberty 5 decades after slavery was abolished in France in 1848. French conquest of the West African interior began in 1850s, then sort of ground to a halt, and really became a concerted effort in the 1880s and 1890s, and they through military force conquered most of West Africa. The French army spearheaded the conquest. It was often at odds, the officers and soldiers alike were often at odds with metropolitan Paris policy formulated in Paris, and with the civilian officials on the ground. France was officially opposed to slavery, but in many cases, you don't just want to abolish slavery necessarily because you want to maintain economic productivity and civil order. So, as it turns out, with maintaining order the priority, the French army in West Africa was not abolitionist at all. So there's a military context there, but it was different from what we saw in the United States. The army was not abolitionist, and in fact, as you'll see in the first picture there, whenever they defeated an army, captured territory, they routinely distributed captives to the soldiers, who themselves were mostly former slaves, and they tended to keep the women as wives, and even some of the French officers and men would keep slave women as wives and concubines. And some officers had large retinues, had harems of these soldiers. So this is very different from what the Union Army was doing for the most part in the later years of the Civil War. what France did do was suppress slave raiding and trading and ban corporal punishment. But their plan was to have slavery as an institution die out when the slaves themselves actually died out. And as it turns out, that's what happened. But there's a hidden new slavery, not only in Africa, but all around the world today. It's illegal everywhere, but there are still probably 30 million people held in slaves. And if you can we still need an abolitionist movement now. But what happened was that many of the slaves who were staying with their masters in French West Africa, especially around the town of Banamba, which is marked on the map there, this is where there's plantations growing food supplies and cotton, very similar to the West Indies, to the U.S. South, and so forth. So heavy concentrations of recently enslaved people who had a memory of freedom and knew where they had come from, and they were impatient with the slow or no progress offered to them by the French colonial empire, and they began running away in very large numbers in 1905, and the French army and their masters tried to stop them, but there were too many of them, and in 1905 and 1906 the Banamba slave exodus saw a couple 100,000 leave their masters. Eventually, by 1913, 650,000 to 800,000 of them had run away. So they ended slavery themselves, and in this case, as in the U.S. Civil War and in Brazil, it's the slaves themselves who took the initiatives and made this history, and others followed along somewhat belatedly, but they were partners, as I say, partners in freedom. So once again, I want to emphasize that the agency involved in ending slavery came from the people who were oppressed by it themselves. They had help, of course, from abolitionists, from some soldiers, from politicians and statesmen. But in fact, most abolitionists in the United States were not white or not professional political activists. The majority were black Americans themselves, and they helped out in the ways they could, when they could. They didn't come from wealthy families, and they posed a great risk. But all of these people, these very otherwise obscure people, made this very important part of history. So I'm going to wrap up now and give you some conclusions. First of all, Benjamin Butler, as we know, was appointed as a political general, which is a term of opprobrium used for him and some of the others. But I see that as a badge of honor too, because while he was a, shall we say, subpar field commander as a general, as a political general, he read the tea leaves of the rapidly changing political situation in the United States, and was able to act in ways that would advance the Union cause. And this is one of them, depriving the South of their most important labor supply and turning some of them into soldiers. Well, Ben Butler, along with Frank Baker, Shepard Mallory, and James Townsend, we must always remember those names. I think they made one of the great moments, one of the most inspiring moments in U.S. history. I've never visited Fortress Monroe, but I hope to do it. And then when I do, I'm not going to let anybody drive me to the fort, into the fort. I'm going to get out of the car and walk a mile, even if my hip is bothering me, as it often is these days, because I think it should be treated as a kind of pilgrimage in honor of the three men and many others who came after them. So slaves exercised tremendous historical agency in freeing themselves and others through flight. Once again, I will quote Frederick Douglass: "Those who would be free must themselves strike the blow," but I will add a crucial corollary: strike in concert with powerful and effective allies, and Ben Butler was most definitely among them. So now that I'm working toward this new understanding of Butler, I can't wait to share what I've learned with the New Orleans Johnsons when I go down there, because after all, New Orleans are very happy to instruct Southerners, and we're good at it too. Thank you very much.
Well done.